Hello, Ella Garrud, the Living Seas Officer of Sussex Wildlife Trust. It's very exciting to be able to speak to you today about the coast and the living seas and talk to someone actually working with this area that I've been so focused on during this residency. It's lovely to meet you. Can you tell me a bit more? Can you tell me a bit more about the living coast here and the story, because it's an incredibly diverse ecosystem, isn't it?
It is, yeah, and I think one of the problems in with UK marine conservation is that people kind of have this view that UK oceans are sort of grey and empty and there's nothing in there, and that's absolutely not true. We have so many different fascinating ecosystems that are absolutely full of diversity, and obviously your project is focusing on seaweed, and we have huge diversity in seaweed algae species. So we have lots of different rocky shores along our coast in Sussex. I know you've been focusing on the Undercliff area, so that's actually in a marine conservation zone called Beachy Head West. Let me make sure I've got that right. I always get my west and my east mixed up. There's a Beach Head East and a Beach Head West. Yes, Beach Head West, which was designated in 2013. So that's got specific protections, sort of protecting the chalk reef, the rocky shore, which is the habitat there. And yeah, we get lots of different seaweed species. So seaweed ecology, it's sort of like rocky shores are zoned because it's a intertidal area, that every species that lives there needs to be able to adapt to being exposed and out of the water for some period of time, and also being inundated by the ocean. And obviously the further up the shore you get, the longer time they will be exposed to the air and the sun, and then obviously the lower you get, the more often they'll be inundated with the water. And they also, big storms and happen, and they have to be adapted to surviving the big wave action and everything like that. What's actually interesting with Sussex is that a lot of our shores are quite flat. So compared to other areas, we don't always see that really specific sort of zonation. We do get a bit of it, definitely. But yeah, like I say, compared to other areas, it's not really distinct. So generally we call it just, it's very simple, upper shore, middle shore and lower shore. And you'll get different types of species in each one, including the seaweeds. So we get lots of rack species like bladder rack, spiral rack,
serrated rack.
Serrated rack, thank you. Mine's gone
because I've been using that in some of my botanical printing.
Yeah, they're really fascinating species, and although they have that kind of green hue, they're actually brown seaweeds. So all seaweeds have chlorophyll and they photosynthesize like plants, but the brown seaweeds has another pigment in there which masks the chlorophyll, making it brown. And I always forget its name, but it is fucoxanthin, that's it. In the brown.
Yeah. Can you spell that?
FUCO.
Yeah.
ZAN. Sorry, XAN.
XAN.
Yeah.
Okay.
THIN.
THIN. See, it was a good job I asked you to spell it. Sounds quite a complicated word.
Yeah.
I'll bring that up later. I discovered yesterday that when I pour boiling water on serrated rack in preparation for some of the work that I'm doing, it turns green. So that was it. I was like, oh, it turns bright green.
That's revealing the chlorophyll colour when you do that. Yeah.
So do you know what that fucoxanthin is? Is it a protein or something? Or
it's just a pigment, I think. Yeah.
It's a colour changing pigment then. Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. And then
something to work on there. Can I extract it? Can I extract that pigment?
Interesting.
Yeah.
And then of course you get the red seaweeds, which has a different pigment which makes it red.
Do you know what that is? Or
yes, I can tell you. So I'm terrible at Latin pronunciation, which is
yeah. Well, nobody knows how Latin should be correctly pronounced, so
it's
all up for grabs.
phycoerythrin.
Phyco, like seaweed.
So that's PHYCO.
Yeah.
ERY.
ERY.
THRIN.
Okay. Red seaweed pigment.
And I think you mentioned Irish moss earlier, which is a red seaweed. And I don't know if you've ever seen it. Have you been to the rock pools at, say, Ovingdean or Saltdean?
Yeah.
And have you seen Irish moss?
Yeah.
When it's under the water and it gives this blue iridescent at its...
See, I've been trying to capture that, but I haven't, because I did buy a UV torch, and I managed to get one of the seaweed to sort of glow, but it wasn't the Irish moss, so maybe another trip is needed.
Yeah, so if you've got a sunny day and you're just looking at some, and it has to be under the water, I guess it's to do with the refraction of the light that brings out the iridescence. Yeah, it's really beautiful. It's just kind of like almost sparkles under the water. It's really...
I haven't seen it doing that. What I've been trying to do is, so as not to like interfere with the ecosystems and stuff, is I've been picking a lot up off the beach after the tide's gone out, so because I don't want to go and take from the ecosystem. The only thing I did clip a bit off of was the Sargassum muticum, because I read it was an invasive species.
Yes, it is.
So I figured that was fair game, that one, that it deserved it because it's not supposed to be there. So I also read that one can produce agarose for microbiology and sort of research purposes. So I'm quite interested to know whether we could cut it all off and make agarose with it at some point. Anyway, that's just a thought I'm putting out there in the world. I think I can't help but, because I was reading about how seaweed is such a it's so good for it's so good for capturing carbon, and that seaweed farming is kind of carbon negative, so it's taking in more carbon than it's putting out. And I was wondering about like whether it's now time to sort of relook at agars and seaweeds and stuff, because I mean, even in the case of like our diets are changing, and maybe we're more open to eating some of the local
I mean,
as well as
there's been a big increased interest in seaweed farming. So I've been working on a project, it's just recently been rebranded to the Sussex Kelp Restoration Project, but it's been under the name of Help Our Kelp for a while. So that is a project to basically try and regenerate the kelp forests of Sussex, which used to be dense and quite extensive in West Sussex. But then since the 1980s, basically it's almost been completely decimated. I think over 95% loss. And that's been attributed to basically a number of factors, but one of the controllable factors is the trawling fishing, and that's where they drag massive nets along the sea floor, really heavy nets, and it just destroys almost everything that it comes across. And so lots of the kelp was lost in the massive storms of 1987, but then because that opened up that area to the trawlers, which were had previously been inaccessible because the kelp forest was so dense. But then because of the repeated trawling in that area, it's believed that has stopped the kelp from regenerating, because any new settlement will just get completely bulldozed over and over. So the Sussex IFCA, who are the Inshore Fisheries and Conservation Authority, created this bylaw to exclude trawling from a massive area of West Sussex. It actually extends across the whole Sussex coastline, both counties, but the majority of that area is in West Sussex because that's where the kelp forests used to be. And that was finally put into place in March this year. It had to be signed off by the MMO, the Marine Monitoring Organisation, and then signed off by George Eustace, who's the Environment Secretary. So we were waiting for that for over a year in the end, but it finally came into play. So now trawling is excluded from an area of over 300 kilometers squared, which is amazing. So now we're hoping that the kelp will start to regenerate naturally, but potentially in the future there may be some initiatives to do some sort of reseeding projects. That will all need, you know, pilot studies, and we need the right licenses and all that sort of legislative stuff around it.
So what would that involve? Diving down and actually planting some kelp from somewhere?
There are different methods. So there's one called green gravel. I'm not entirely sure how it works, but essentially you have, because kelp needs hard substrate to grow on, and you seed this green gravel and then put it into the environment where it used to be, and then it continues to grow. I mean, that's extremely basic explanation of what it is, but that's essentially what happens. And so we're working with a number of academics at universities locally, including Uni of Sussex and Brighton and UCL, and also ZSL, Zoological Society of London. So there's loads of different work going on behind the scenes, collecting the data that we need to prove that this bylaw is actually working and helping the kelp come back. And like you said, in terms of carbon storage, it's quite complicated because, yes, kelp draws down carbon, but most of the studies around how much it captures and sequesters comes from like giant kelp species, say in California. And because kelp is it dies back every year, every 1 or 2 years, depending on the species. So unlike sort of seagrass, which draws down the carbon and then it gets stored in the sediment, because kelp grows on hard substrate, that hard substrate doesn't lock down that carbon. So once the kelp then sort of dies back, fronds get ripped off in storms, whatever, generally what happens is those get transported out by the sea to deep sea sediments where they sink, and that's where the carbon actually gets stored. But because in Sussex, in the English Channel, we don't have that deep sea habitat where that happens. We don't actually know in this environment how much carbon a dense kelp forest could actually capture. So there is going to be work looking at that to try and actually quantify how much gets sequestered in the long run, basically. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And it's been a bit controversial, hasn't it? On the side of the trawling.
Well, yeah, so there was a lot of pushback from fishermen. Some of the local fishers supported it because now that area is now kind of more open to the potters and the netters, because the trawlers are not there anymore. You know, their pots won't get destroyed, or they're not in the way. So part of the sort of impact assessment of the bylaw was that it would increase the productivity of the like potting fishery. But obviously from the trawlers there was quite strong backlash, which is, you know, understandable, but it actually only affects, I think, a maximum of 9 boats, this trawling exclusion. And I know you mentioned the Greenpeace thing where they dropped the boulders.
Yeah, I read about that in the Argus.
So that was actually nothing, that was offshore. So it's got nothing to do with the trawling exclusion zone, because that's a very near shore area. And Greenpeace was sort of doing it to highlight the fact that trawling is happening in these protected areas offshore. So it's much deeper, and it's, you know, it's nowhere near where we are. So it's very different types of trawling.
Not so involving the seaweeds.
Sorry?
Not really involving the seaweeds at that.
No, it was more about it's happening in these marine protected areas, and boulders were dropped to try and deter the trawlers, which, you know, it's a one method to go about it. And it, you know, it is quite controversial.
Yeah.
From the wildlife trust.
It's good to clarify that it's nothing to do with the kelp, because
Yeah, I think
these things, I kind of got the impression it was. So if I'm making that mistake and I'm actually
yeah,
actively trying to read
absolutely.
about it, it's good to clarify that the kelp protected area, or the sort of future kelp forest area that we'll hopefully get back, is not connected to those kind of protests, and that
No,
it's already being protected, and that the science is now being done to prove
exactly.
the
I think
research.
people see the word trawling, and then just because there's been all this news around the trawling bylaw,
Mm,
and if it's not, you know, headlines are sensationalized, aren't they? So,
yeah.
and often people might not read the whole article and just then assume it's the same happening in the same area because it's about trawling, but it's not. It's completely separate.
I think most newspapers only put the actual truth in the last paragraph.
Yeah.
My experience reading them.
Yeah, it can be
Anyway,
quite.
it's been lovely speaking to you about this today and learning so much about it. Thank you so much for joining me and explaining all this stuff.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you.